In this lecture, we're going to learn how to render a list. If you think about it, lists are used for a lot of things. Menus, users, posts, etc. It's a common task in most applications. View can help us loop through an array of items to render a list of elements. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file with some initial files. Download it, unzip the contents, and point your editor to the files. Pause the video if you need to. There's nothing special going on in these files. Inside the JavaScript file, I have two data properties. We'll be looping through them. These two properties represent the three scenarios you'll come across when rendering lists. You'll either want to loop through an array of objects, or loop through an object's properties. We can handle these three scenarios in Vue. For our first example, I have an array of birds. Inside the template, we're going to create an unordered list with one list item. To loop through an array, you have to use the v-for directive. I'm going to apply this to the list item. This directive will allow us to loop through an array. The expression will be slightly different than what we've dealt with so far. Vue requires a specific format for the expression. We're going to input the following: bird in birds. The format is as follows. We need to provide an alias to reference the item in the current iteration of the loop. For instance, the first item in the array is pigeons. So, in the first iteration, the name bird will represent the value pigeons. In the second iteration, it'll be eagles, so on and so forth. Afterward, we need to type the in keyword. This keyword will tell Vue that you're ready to tell it what array it will loop through. Lastly, we pass in the name of the array to loop through, which is the bird's data property. Be aware that you're not forced to name your reference anything specific. We could have called this flying creature if we wanted to. It's common practice to name the alias as the singular version of the array name. That's the basics of using the v-for directive. We can begin outputting the data. Inside the list item, we're going to create an expression. The expression will be bird. Vue will take care of performing interpolation on this expression. It'll replace it with the current item in the array. We're not limited to using expressions inside the element. We can apply directives to the element. We can use the bird reference. For instance, we can bind the class attribute to the bird alias. We can't use the bird reference outside of the element. We're restricted to using it on or in the element. This would include children elements if we had any. It's time to test the app in the browser. If we did everything right, we will see the list of birds on the page. Inspect the elements and search for the list items. Each list item will have the class attribute applied to it with the bird's name as the class name. These don't do anything, but I wanted to show you that you can use the reference in directives or attributes as well. You're not limited to grabbing the value. Sometimes you'll want to grab the index in the loop. Back inside the template, we're going to wrap the bird alias with parentheses. If we're solely interested in the value of the current iteration, we can provide an alias for the value. However, if we'd like to grab the index and value, we'll need to wrap this part of the expression with parentheses. Vue requires we provide an alias for the name and index. We're going to call this index. We're not required to use this name. We can call it whatever we want. It's common practice to call it index. As a result, the alias bird will be used to represent the value in the current iteration, whereas the alias index will be used to represent the current index of the item. We'll be able to use the index in our loop. We're going to add an expression after the value. The expression will output the index. Let's refresh the page to see what this will look like. The index, along with the name of the bird, will appear on the list. Vue makes it dead simple to loop through an array of items. Next, let's begin looping through an array of objects. I want to quickly review the data in the view instance for a moment. We have a data property called people. This property is an array of objects. Each object is storing an individual's name and age. We want to display this information on the page. It's very similar to the last example. Switching to the template, we're going to create a horizontal line. Under it, we'll create another unordered list. We're adding this in to help make things look cleaner. If we want to loop through the objects in the array, we'll have to use the v-for directive. We'll add the directive to the list item element. The expression will be the following: person in people. We can begin to output the contents of the object. We'll create two sets of div tags to output the name and age properties. To access the name and age, we can use dot notation. It's the same as accessing a property in a regular JavaScript object. It's not much different. Let's give things a test. If I were to refresh the page, the list of people would appear below with each person's name and age. This is exactly what we wanted. However, there is a bit of a problem. What if we had dozens of properties to display? Having to type each property name would be time-consuming. Luckily, the v-for directive is capable of looping through objects as well. We're not limited to looping through arrays. Back inside the template, we're going to remove the second pair of div tags. Then, we're going to apply the v-for directive to the div element and set the expression to value key in person. The alias names we set in the parentheses represent slightly different values than when we worked with arrays. In the previous example, the first name would represent the value in the current iteration. The second name would represent the index. However, when you're looping through properties in an object, the first name will represent the property's value, and the second name will represent the key name of that property. Therefore, the index is no longer available to us. If we want to use the index, then we'll need to add one more name. I'm going to set this to index. We'll be given access to the value, key name, and index. We're going to output all three of these inside the current loop. We're essentially looping inside of another loop. It's not uncommon to have to do things like this. It's a completely valid solution. Be careful when performing nested loops. It does require more time to execute. It won't be noticeable in our application, but in larger ones, you'll definitely see the performance difference. Let's give things a test. Refreshing the page will result in the same thing as before. We have a list of people. Each person has their name and age outputted. Fantastic. Keep in mind that you're not required to use all these values. You can stick to grabbing the value of the property. If you don't need the key name or index, it's not required to provide aliases. Keep your code simple. There is one more thing I want to show you before we end things. There is a problem with the loops we currently have. Let's focus on the first loop. You may want to implement a feature that will allow your users to filter the data. Sometimes you may even want to add or remove things from the current array. In any of these situations, you may want to keep track of each item. Currently, that's not possible. You may be thinking, what about their index? That works at the start, but the index isn't wholly reliable. For instance, the last bird in this array is parrots. The index of this bird is 3. Each item in the array will have a unique index, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the index is permanently associated with that item in the array. Let me show you what I mean. I'll open the console for a moment. I'll input the following: vm.birds.shift. This function will remove the first item in the array. Looking at the list again, you'll notice the index for parrots has changed to 2. The index is still unique, but it has changed. Vue is capable of keeping track of these changes for you. For example, we'll change the name of the bird by using the following: vm.birds2 equals robins. This line will change the bird in the second index from parrots to robins. This works without a problem. However, something as simple as this can prove to be problematic down the line. Inside a more complex application, items in the array can move around due to additions or removal of data. This can confuse Vue. It can even lead to an update where you don't want an update to occur. This issue can happen because Vue has lost track of certain elements. That's not what we want to happen. Luckily, there's a way to keep track of items in arrays even if they move around. Back inside the template, we're going to bind the key attribute on the list item. The value for this must be a unique name for each iteration in the loop. We have a basic array where each bird has a unique name. We can set this to bird. Now we have a way to uniquely identify an item in the array even if any of their positions change. Let's give this a try. I'm going to switch back to the browser and refresh. The list will work as usual. You may be a little confused because we can't see the difference in this example. Once again, this is useful in more complex applications. In the next lecture, I'll dive more into why this is important and provide a more realistic example. If you already understand without having to see the problem, you can skip that lecture and move right along. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the official documentation page for list rendering. I recommend you give this a read before moving on. It also offers a better explanation of the key attribute. If you don't understand, then don't worry. I'll clear everything up in the next lecture.